Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and I've got a great unit ready for y'all today. So last time we were talking about cells. We're switching it up today and we're talking about a different topic. Today we're going to be discussing macromolecules. Today I'm just really going to introduce them, give you some examples, and tell you why they're so important for us to consider. Okay, so let's go ahead and hop into this. So I wanted to remind everyone, these are levels of organization. We talked about these a lot last time, but I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of where we're at. Now, our whole last unit was talking about cells and organelles. So we were kind of down here in this level of levels of organization. Today we're actually going a little bit smaller. Today we're talking about macromolecules. Now, what are macromolecules? Well, remember that the prefix macro means large, and a molecule is just a bunch of atoms that have been fused together. So what is a macromolecule? It's a large molecule. It's a lot of atoms that have all been put together. And you know some examples of these. These macromolecules can be hundreds or even thousands of atoms large, okay? So today I'm going to give you some examples, why they're important, and just kind of give you an overview of macromolecules as a whole. So let's go ahead and hop into it. What are macromolecules? Macromolecules are the building blocks of life. So last time we talked about how cells are the basic unit of structure and function for life. Macromolecules are the things that come together to make up cells. So if cells are the basic unit of life, then macromolecules are the things we use to build life. Okay, so macromolecules, they're smaller than cells, they're smaller than organelles, but when you get a lot of macromolecules working together, you can make life. Okay, so what are macromolecules? Well, you might hear them called by a couple different names. Sometimes people call them biological macromolecules or biological molecules. Sometimes people call them macronutrients, and you'll kind of understand why people call them that here in just a second. Me, I just call them macromolecules. Again, these are large molecules. Okay, these are large molecules. They're made up of smaller organic molecules. So one example that we'll talk about today is like a carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is a lot like water, it's just bigger. Okay, so macro means large, and a molecule is a bunch of atoms fused together. So a macromolecule is a large molecule. Okay, there are 4 types of macromolecules. Okay, here's the order that we're going to talk about them in. So we'll talk about carbohydrates first, and then proteins, and then we'll talk about lipids, and then we'll talk about nucleic acids. Now, these are very scientific names, but you've heard people discuss them with different names before. So for example, if you've ever heard someone talk about carbs, right? Sometimes people want to make sure they're not eating too many carbs. Those are carbohydrates. So carbs is just another word for carbohydrates. Okay, lipids, that's just a fancy science name for fats. So if you ever hear someone talking about fats, fats are things like oil and butter. If people are talking about fats, that's just another name for lipids. Okay, usually people just call protein, so you know what those are. And then nucleic acids, these are inside of all of our cells. One example of a nucleic acid is DNA. DNA is called deoxyribonucleic acid. So DNA is a really important example of nucleic acids. Okay, so those are the 4 that we're going to talk about today. I'm going to give you some kind of background information, what they're mostly used for in your body, and we'll just kind of hop into this as the unit goes on. Okay, so why are macromolecules important to the human body? Well, macromolecules are essential to make your body work the way that it's supposed to. Here are a couple of examples. 1, carbohydrates are the body's main source of energy. So imagine you're driving your car around town. Is the car going to work if it doesn't have any gas in it? It's not really going to work very well. The same thing is true for your body. Your body, you're not going to be able to do much if you don't have carbohydrates to burn. Okay, so carbohydrates are the main source of energy for living organisms. Okay, lipids are kind of like a reserved energy. Okay, it's how we store energy to use later on. Lipids are also really important for insulation. So I want you to imagine like any animal that lives in a really cold environment, maybe a polar bear or a seal or a whale. They live in like sub-zero environments. A lot of those animals have a layer of a special type of fat called blubber. Okay, that blubber helps to keep them warm. So lipids are really important for storing energy. It's also really important for insulation, which means to keep you warm. That's why sometimes people who have a little bit more lipids tend to be a little warm and can get hot easier than people who don't have much lipids on their body. Okay. Something else we're going to talk about are called proteins. Proteins are what your muscles are made out of, so they help keep us strong. Muscles are really important. They help you move around, and so anyone who's interested in getting stronger or playing sports, you probably know a lot about proteins and how important they are to building those muscles up bigger, okay? And then also nucleic acids are responsible for making each person functional and unique. It's how we pass on our genetic information. So why are macromolecules important to our body? Well, you've probably heard of this little saying before, and growing up, I used to always kind of think it was like a figurative statement. Have you ever heard someone say, "You are what you eat"? Well, I kind of thought that was like, kind of a nonsense statement, but as we study macromolecules more, you'll learn that that is a literal statement. You are what you eat, meaning that the stuff that you consume later gets incorporated into your body. So if you're eating really healthy, high nutritional value foods, you're giving your body better building blocks to make yourself out of. If you're just eating junk food and food that's not very good for you, it's going to affect the way you feel. You're not going to have that good energy to burn off. So the reason that these are so important is because it's what your body is and what your body runs off of. So these are incredibly important to humans and any type of living organism. Okay, one thing that you've probably heard people talk about a lot when it comes to food and the food they're eating is this stuff called calories. And so I just kind of wanted to take a second and talk about what are calories, what is a caloric value. Okay, so calories are how we measure how much energy is in your food. Okay, technically, a calorie is the amount of energy needed to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So it's really a way to measure temperature more so than anything else. If a food has a lot of calories in it, it has a lot of energy. If a food doesn't have a lot of calories in it, it doesn't have a lot of energy. People are concerned with calories a lot because if you want to lose weight, basically the way to do that is that you want to be expending more calories than you're bringing in. And if you do that, you're in a calorie deficit and you're going to lose weight. So when you hear someone talking about, oh, this has so many calories, how many calories have I had today? They might be trying to lose weight, they might be trying to add weight, but it's just a way to keep up with how much energy you're actually putting inside of your body, okay? Something else that's really important when it comes to macromolecules are these two terms on the board here. We have monomers and polymers. The best thing to do to remember what these words are is let's just remember what these prefixes mean. Okay, mono is a prefix that means one. You may have heard of a monocle, which is like glasses that only has one glass on it, right? Or a monopoly is when one person owns everything in a certain corporation, right? So mono means one. Kind of the opposite of mono is this other prefix called poly. Poly is a prefix that means many, okay? So anytime you hear a word that has that prefix poly in it, it usually has a lot of small units inside of it, okay? The words that we're going to be using for this unit are monomers and polymers. So monomers are small units of organic molecules, and polymers are large units of organic molecules that are made of many different monomers. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, okay? But kind of just a brief overview, kind of imagine a brick house. Imagine a brick house, okay? The house is made up of a lot of different bricks. So in this example, each individual brick would be a monomer, and the house as a total is a polymer, because the house is made of many smaller units. They're made of bricks. So in this example, bricks are the monomers, and the house is the polymer, okay? So let's talk about elements. Elements are anything on the periodic table. So if you know anything about the periodic table, everything on the periodic table is an element. The elements that we're really concerned with for this unit are just maybe 3 to 5 of them. So every macromolecule, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, they all have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in them. All 4 of them have those 3 elements. Some of these macromolecules have an additional element to go along with it. So for example, proteins also have the element nitrogen in it. Okay, so lipids, carbohydrates are just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Protein are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, as well as nitrogen. okay? And then nucleic acids have an additional element called phosphorus. So let's take a look at those real quick. So this is the periodic table, and I just kind of wanted to point out where those elements are. You can see that these are all fairly light and small atoms, okay? They're all in the first two rows. This isn't a chemistry class, so I wouldn't worry about it too much, but one thing you do want to know, look at carbon on the periodic table. You can tell from where carbon is on the periodic table that it really likes to bond with other elements. You can see how it's, if you're looking at this, if you're looking at carbon right here, if you go over 4 blocks, 1, 2, 3, 4, you're all the way to the right. And when you get into a chemistry class, that's going to tell you that carbon likes to bond and it likes to make 4 bonds. And so the reason that these elements are used is that they fuse and bond with other elements very readily. Okay, so carbon is a element and it likes to make a lot of bonds. That's really what we want to know out of this. And then there's a couple of other elements that we're working with. We have hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. These are the elements used in macromolecules. Okay? Let's keep it going. So I've kind of introduced macromolecules as a whole. I just kind of wanted to talk about some of the individual macromolecules and give you a little background on them. Okay? So carbohydrates. I told y'all earlier that another word you'll probably hear people use are carbs. Well, what are some other examples of carbohydrates? Well, sugars are carbohydrates. If it's sweet, it's probably a carbohydrate. Another example of a carbohydrate is a starch. Well, what is a starch? Okay, I want you to think of potatoes or rice or pastas. Those are all types of starches, and we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. Basically, just think of it as a complex sugar. It's not just one sugar molecule, it's a bunch of sugar that's been bound together, okay? So what are carbohydrates made out of? Well, they're made up of C, H, and O, so that's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, okay? And you actually know of another molecule that has this same ratio. Okay, think of the chemical equation for water. It's H2O. So there's twice as many hydrogens as there are oxygens in a water molecule. The same thing's going on here. In a carbohydrate, you're always going to have twice as many hydrogens as you do oxygens or carbons. And actually the name carbohydrates tells you that. So look at the second part of that word, hydrates. If I told you to make sure you're hydrating or hydrated, what does that make you think of? It makes you think of water, right? To hydrate means to drink water. Well, basically a carbohydrate is a water molecule that has a bunch of carbon fused in it. And you can see that in the first part of the word, carbohydrate, right? It's a water with a carbon added to it. That's what a carbohydrate is. So there's a couple of different examples of carbohydrates. You can have really simple sugars. Another name for that is a monosaccharide. Remember, I told you earlier that the small building blocks are called monomers. And so the monomer of a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. So they kind of sound alike, so that's something easy to remember. Let's look at the word monosaccharide and break it down a little bit. Now, I already told you that mono, like a monocle, is a prefix that means one. Well, what does the word saccharide mean? Saccharide is just a fancy scientific word for sugar. So what is a monosaccharide? It is one sugar molecule. And a really important example of this is glucose. Glucose is basically what your body runs off of. Okay, so we really need a lot of glucose in your diet in order to make your body work the way it's supposed to. Sometimes those monosaccharides, those monomers, can come together to make a bigger molecule, a complex carbohydrate. An example of a complex carbohydrate is a polysaccharide. Now, we talked about earlier, the big molecules are usually called polymers. So what's the polymer of a carbohydrate? It's a polysaccharide. They kind of sound alike. They have the same prefix in them, right? Because polysaccharide, remember, poly means many and saccharide means sugar. So what's a polysaccharide? It's many sugars fused together. And a couple of examples of this are starches. What are starches? Those are breads, pastas, and potatoes are all examples of starches. Or cellulose, which is really important for plant cells. It makes up the cell wall. Kind of a little cheat that I like to tell students when it comes to carbohydrates is that if it's coming from a plant, it's probably a carbohydrate in one way or another. So like think of bread. Bread comes from wheat. Wheat is a plant, so it's a carbohydrate. Pasta is the same thing. It's made out of flour. Flour is made with wheat. Wheat is a plant, so it's a carbohydrate. Also, anything sweet. If it has sugar in it, it's probably coming from sugar cane. That's a plant, and so it's a carbohydrate. The only plants that aren't carbohydrates would be things like nuts, legumes, beans, and avocados. Those are kind of some niche situations, but 90% of the time, if it's coming from a plant, it's a carbohydrate. Okay, so let's talk about the function of carbohydrates in a little bit more detail. Carbohydrates, their main function is that they are the main source of energy for a cell. It's what your body runs off of. So anyone who like runs long distance, or maybe you go to baseball or soccer tournaments or anything like that, sometimes what people will do before a big race or before a big tournament is the night before they'll eat a lot of a certain type of food. What type of food will they eat sometimes a lot before a big race or before a big tournament? Sometimes people will have this thing called a pasta party. What they'll do is they'll carbo load. So if you have a really long race, imagine you got to go run a marathon tomorrow. What you should do is tonight you should fuel up, right? You want to fuel up your gas tank with some energy. And so what you should do is you should have a pasta party. You eat a lot of starches the night before. You can eat potatoes or rice or pasta. That's kind of like if you were going on let's say you're going on vacation, you got to drive a lot the next day. Well, to get out of the city, to get to that next state, you're going to have to fill up your gas tank with gas, right? You fill it up, and then that way you're ready to go. That's the same thing as carbo loading. If you eat a lot of carbs the night before, you'll have a lot of energy to burn off the next day, okay? Sometimes I have pasta parties and I don't have anything going on the next day. I just really like pasta, okay? So the last thing I want to talk about with these macromolecules here is that they're mostly, I told you earlier that they come from plants. Well, that's because plants photosynthesize them, okay? The only thing that plants can really eat is sugar, and they make the sugar themselves. And so plants will take sunlight and water and oxygen, fuse it together in a special way, make glucose, and then that's what they eat and what they consume for energy, okay? So let's talk about proteins. Okay, so that was carbohydrates, moving on to something else called proteins. What are proteins? Examples of these would be like any type of meat, okay? Legumes, nuts and beans have a lot of proteins in them. Eggs have a lot of proteins in them, okay? Proteins are a molecule that are made of chains of amino acids. So in this situation, amino acids are the monomers and proteins are the polymers. Okay, the amino acids are made up of 4 different elements. You can have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So that's the CHON. Okay, and sometimes you'll have a different element called sulfur. Okay, so something that I like to tell students is that carbohydrates and lipids are CHO, so CHO, and then proteins are CHON. If you can remember that, CHO, CHON, that's going to help you remember the elements that make them up. So what are proteins made up of? They're made up of amino acids. What are amino acids made up of? CHON, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Okay? So when we're talking about amino acids, there are 20 types of amino acids. Okay? And they can come together in different ways to make a lot of different types of proteins. So when it's coming for amino acids, you have 2 types of amino acids. You can have essential amino acids or non-essential amino acids. And what we're talking about, if you know what the word essential means that you have to have it, right? If it's essential, you have to have it, you have to do it. Well, 12 of the amino acids can be made in the human body. So we say that those are non-essential because your body can make them. The other 8 are essential amino acids, and the reason that they're essential is that you have to eat them in your diet. You're not going to get them from anywhere else. And so you can get those 8 essential amino acids from foods like nuts, beans, or meat. Okay? What are proteins used for? Well, when you look in the mirror and you're looking at yourself, what you mostly see are proteins. So proteins are the building blocks of your body. It's what your body is made out of. There is a slight misconception that proteins are used for energy, and although that can be the case, it's very rare. Mostly we use proteins to make your body, and we don't use proteins for energy. Proteins are so important that we don't want to burn them up as energy when we can just use carbohydrates or lipids instead. And I'll talk more about proteins and how they can be used as energy a little later on. Okay? Proteins actually have the same caloric value per gram as carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, you get 4 calories per gram out of carbohydrates, and you get 4 calories per gram out of proteins as well. So there's actually a 1-to-1 ratio in between proteins and carbohydrates. Okay, let's talk about fats. Again, fats is just another word for lipids. So if you ever hear someone talking about lipids or fats, they're kind of talking about the same thing. Lipids have a couple of different jobs as well. One, they're used for storage, and what we mean is like storing energy. They're long-term energy. If carbohydrates are short-term energy, lipids are long-term energy. We'll use these when we don't have any carbohydrates to burn. So go back to my example with those certain animals with blubber. For example, polar bears, when there's a lot of food, they eat all the food they can and they build up their blubber supply. Then in the winter, they'll hibernate. It's harder to find food, but they have all that blubber, they have all that fat to burn off over months of time. You know, they'll still do a little eating and hunting and getting out, but the food is so much harder to come by that they really don't have much to eat. So they got to burn their fat off in order to stay alive. Okay? So what are lipids mostly made out of? Well, we can make them out of these things called glycerol and fatty acids. They come together to make a lipid. Okay? We use lipids also in the cell to make the cell membrane. Okay? And then what's the formation of these lipids? Well, they're long chains of carbon and hydrogen. So fats, lipids, and carbohydrates are made out of the same thing. They're both carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but their structure is a little bit different, and fats, lipids don't have that 1-to-2-to-1 ratio like I was talking about with the carbohydrates. The reason that lipids are such good ways to store energy is that they actually contain more energy per gram than carbohydrates or protein. So there's a little more calories in fats than there are carbohydrates or proteins. Okay, so what I wanted to do is I kind of have this picture of this pizza here, and I wanted to talk about where you might be able to find some of these different macromolecules that we've been talking about. And make sure you're paying attention, because I have a little assignment for y'all to work on that's very similar to this when I'm done talking up here. So where are we getting these different macromolecules out of your diet? Okay, well, we talked about earlier how proteins are mostly made up of, you get when you're eating meats or beans or nuts, pork, all of that would be examples of protein. So when I'm looking at this pizza here, those little pepperonis, those are great examples of protein. Okay, that's meat, and so that's where your proteins are coming from out of this meal. Okay, where are you getting your carbohydrates from? Well, remember, carbohydrates are sugars and grains. In this pizza, you would find the carbohydrates in the starches and the flour that make up the crust of the pizza. Okay, other examples of carbohydrates would be like certain type of chips, if they're made out of potatoes, or if it's a corn chip, those would be examples of carbohydrates as well. Also, pasta, bread, rice, and potatoes are all great examples of carbohydrates, okay? Lastly, where are you getting your lipids from out of your diet? Well, you might be getting them from oils or butter. In this example, it would be the fat and the oil used to cook the pizza crust, or if you're eating potato chips, they're probably fried in some oil, and so that would be where you're getting your lipids from out of that meal. Okay, so here's what I'm going to have y'all do. I'm going to talk about some of these diets real quick, and then I'm going to have y'all make a restaurant menu based off of a certain type of diet. And these are just some examples. If you have your own diet that you want to use, that's totally fine, but here are some examples that you might use. So you've probably heard of the Atkins diet. What is the Atkins diet? when you're on this type of diet, you want to eat a lot of proteins, but you want to avoid carbohydrates. If you avoid carbohydrates, this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. Proteins can be used for energy, but we don't do it very often. If you totally cut carbohydrates out of your body, out of your diet, your body gets into a different state and it'll start to burn proteins for energy instead of carbs. It's called ketosis, and basically it's just a different way your body can make energy, okay? Another type of diet you might want to consider, this is probably the best overall diet to follow. There's been a lot of research into this. People who follow the Mediterranean diet have really good cardiovascular health. Sometimes the average age, the life expectancy can be older for people who follow this Mediterranean diet. So what is the Mediterranean diet? Well, in this, we're gonna eat a lot of fish and soybeans for protein, and we're gonna eat a lot of vegetables. Okay, so that's a Mediterranean diet. Think of like foods that are common and easy to find in the Mediterranean area. Okay, so that's the Mediterranean diet. Another type of diet is called the South Beach diet. Okay, here we're eating whole grains for carbohydrates instead of simple sugars. So what that means is like nothing sweet, no Cokes, no sodas, no candy, nothing sweet. Instead, we're eating whole grain, which is like whole grain bread. It's bread and pasta and rice that hasn't been processed very much. So it's a very natural type of diet to follow. Another diet is called the keto diet. Here we're eating a low carb diet. Most of your calories are coming from protein and fat, and there's no simple sugar. So again, if you're following that keto diet, that puts your body into a state of ketosis, which means your body's not burning carbohydrates anymore, it's burning proteins instead. The last one is called a paleo diet. The idea here is you want to eat kind of like a caveman did, so like the Paleolithic, what they were eating. And so here, if you want to follow a paleo diet, you would eat whole, unprocessed foods. You would try to eat a lot of lean meats. Chicken is a type of lean meat. Fish is a type of lean meat. And you eat lots of fruits and vegetables, and you try to avoid processed foods. Okay, these are a couple of examples, but there are a lot more. A really common type of diet might just be high protein. You do everything like you normally do. You could pretty much stay on your regular diet. You just try to eat more proteins. And someone who's trying to put on a lot of muscle, trying to bulk up, might follow a high protein diet. So really pick any diet you can think of, and what I'm gonna have you do, first of all, you'll take a piece of paper and kind of fold it in thirds like this. Okay, we're gonna make a brochure. Your job is you're gonna pick a diet that you wanna follow. It can be a healthy diet, it can be an unhealthy diet, it doesn't matter. Just pick a type of diet, and you're gonna make a restaurant based off of that type of diet. Okay, I've got the directions here I'll go over real quick, but they'll also be on Canvas if you need to go back and look at them. So here's what you're doing. You're gonna create a menu for your restaurant. You pick a diet and you make a menu based off of it, okay? Each restaurant will be based on a diet plan. So any diet plan that you pick here is fine. Then once you have your paper folded into thirds like that, follow these directions. So you're gonna come up with an illustrated cover, come up with a name for your restaurant, maybe what does it look like, and that's gonna be on the front cover. Then I want you to generate a couple of meals to go along with it. And those meals should follow the diet that you picked. So if you picked a high protein diet, lots of meals with a lot of proteins. If you're picking a high fat diet, 5 meals with a lot of fats in them, okay? Then you're gonna come up with some pictures of those meals. Those go on the inside sections. You can draw them, you can print them off, whatever your teacher wants to do is fine, okay? And then you're going to, on one section, you're going to talk about foods that are allowed and foods that are to avoid if you want to stick to this diet. And then lastly, out of your 5 meals, go ahead in one section, give me a description of the macromolecules in those meals, okay? So this is something that I want you to work on. It's gonna kind of be a creative thing. Get creative with it and have fun. But we have some other assignments that I want you to work on. That's gonna help you kind of practice this stuff. Thank you all so much for hanging in there with me. Make sure to give that other work your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.